The winter of 1879 arrived early in the Ozark Highlands of southern Missouri. Elias Thorne discovered this on the third night of November, when he woke to find his breath forming clouds in the dark air above his face, and a half-inch of ice crusted along the inside of his cabin walls. He lay still for a moment, listening to the wind working against the log walls, and understood that the structure he had spent 4 months building was already losing. He had done everything right, or so he believed. His 18 by 22-foot log cabin sat on a stone foundation with tight-fitted walls chinked with mud and horsehair. His iron box stove, a Quincy No. 9 purchased in Springfield at considerable expense and hauled 140 miles by wagon, sat in the northeast corner with a straight pipe chimney rising 14 feet through the roof. His bed, a raised pine plank platform 20 inches off the floor, occupied the opposite wall. Standard construction. Trusted methods. Every neighbor within 8 miles had built essentially the same structure, using the same territorial homesteading guides, the same catalog stoves, and the same inherited assumption that if you built tight walls and fed the fire, you would be warm. By January, Elias had burned through nearly 2 full cords of oak and hickory. His hands were cracked and bleeding from the daily work of splitting and hauling wood through knee-deep snow. The daily routine had become an exhausting loop. Wake before dawn, feed the dying stove, split wood in the dark, haul it inside, feed the stove again, repeat until dark. The fire never truly warmed the cabin. It warmed a circle of air 4 feet around the stove. Beyond that circle, the temperature dropped so sharply that Margaret could see her breath while cooking at the far end of the room. His wife Margaret had developed a persistent cough from sleeping in air that never warmed above 42 degrees Fahrenheit in the far corners of the room. The cough started in December as a dry irritation and deepened through January into something that woke her at 3 in the morning and kept her awake until dawn. Their youngest child, a boy named Thomas, refused to leave the narrow circle of heat around the stove, making normal household activity nearly impossible. Margaret spent most of each day rearranging her work to stay within that circle, cooking, mending, and tending the child, all within a 6-foot radius of the firebox. The problem was visible in the physics of the thing, though Elias did not yet have the language for it. The cast iron stove generated intense rapid heat that rose immediately to the ceiling and escaped through every available gap. The plank floor, raised on joists with open air circulation beneath, pulled cold upward from the frozen ground. The walls, despite the chinking, leaked warmth through dozens of hairline cracks where the mud had dried and pulled away from the logs. Everything Elias produced by burning wood converted almost immediately into warmth that disappeared. The problem was not the cold itself. The problem was that every piece of heat Elias produced vanished within minutes of the fire dying down. He was not heating a cabin. He was heating the outdoors through a very expensive hole in the ground. Elias Thorne had grown up in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, in a community that included German and Swiss immigrant families who had settled the region 2 generations earlier. These families farmed adjacent land and traded at the same markets, and their homes were visibly different from those of Anglo-American settlers in one specific way. They were warmer, not just slightly warmer, dramatically warmer. On winter evenings, when Pennsylvania Dutch families gathered inside their farmhouses, visitors from conventional homes stepped through the door into what felt like a different climate. The source of that difference was a massive clay and stone structure built against one wall of each house, a construction that dominated the room the way a fireplace might, but operated on entirely different principles. Elias had played in those houses as a boy and had laid his hands on the warm stone surfaces without fully understanding what he was touching. His grandfather, Heinrich Thorne, had come from Baden in southwestern Germany, and carried detailed knowledge of these systems from the old country. Heinrich described them as Kachelöfen in his letters, structures that, in their European form, were built by specialist craftsmen using fired ceramic tiles, lime mortar, and carefully calculated flue geometries. Farmhouses in Baden and the Carpathian mountain regions used them as the primary heating source for structures that faced winters as severe as anything Missouri could produce. The fundamental principle was not complicated. A single fire each evening heated the massive stone and clay body of the structure. The stones stored that heat through the night and released it slowly into the room while the family slept. The family did not sit near the stove. The family slept on it. Heinrich's letters described families sleeping on stone benches built into the upper sections of the stove where temperatures stayed between 80 and 100 degrees through the coldest nights. A grandmother with joint pain could sleep warm and wake without stiffness. Children never woke shivering. Water kept near the structure never froze. The fire that produced this comfort burned for 2 hours at dusk and was cold ash by midnight, yet the warmth it deposited into the stone mass continued radiating until the following afternoon. When Elias raised this idea at the weekly gathering at the Callaway trading post in February of 1879, the response was immediate and predictable. "You're gonna haul ton stones into your house and sleep on the floor like a dog?" asked Roy Callaway, who ran the post and considered himself the authority on practical frontier living. Callaway was a large, loud man who had been in the Ozarks for 11 years and believed experience was the only valid teacher. "That's how they do things in the old country because they don't know any better. We got proper stoves now, catalog stoves. You don't need to be building castles." James Whitfield, whose cabin sat a quarter-mile east along the creek bottom, added that masonry work required a trained mason, lime mortar, and fired brick, none of which existed within 40 miles. "You'd spend all spring building a bed and have no time left to plant," he said. "Besides, clay cracks. First hard freeze, and you'd have a pile of rubble and no floor." Whitfield was not a stupid man. He was a practical one, and his objections reflected genuine frontier logic. Materials, time, and labor were all scarce. Any building project that consumed more than a week was a luxury most settlers could not afford. Augustus Meade, who had been in the Ozarks since 1842 and had survived 37 Missouri winters, said simply that he had never heard of a man building a bed out of rocks and living to recommend it. He went back to his coffee. Margaret said nothing at the gathering, but expressed her doubts quietly that evening. The idea of tearing up their cabin floor to build a stone and clay structure that might collapse seemed a poor trade against their already difficult situation. "If it fails," she said, "we lose the floor and we still have no heat." She was not wrong. The risk was real. Elias acknowledged it and said nothing more that night. He had already started sketching in the margins of his grandfather's letters. What Elias understood and his neighbors did not was a single principle that separated effective heating from ineffective heating: thermal mass. An iron stove heats air. Air has almost no capacity to store heat. A cubic foot of air contains so little thermal energy that even slight air movement carries it away instantly. The moment the fire dies, the air cools within minutes, and all that fuel energy escapes through the chimney, through the walls, through every crack and gap in the structure. A cast iron stove is essentially a device for converting firewood into brief, unsustainable heat events, followed by rapid cold. It is efficient at generating heat. It is completely inefficient at keeping heat where human beings need it. Stone and clay work differently. Dense materials absorb heat slowly during a fire and release it slowly for hours afterward. The specific heat capacity of stone, meaning its ability to store thermal energy per pound, is roughly 200 times greater than air. A properly built masonry mass, weighing 1 to 2 tons, heated with a single fire each evening, will radiate steady warmth for 12 to 18 hours after the last log burns down to ash. The fire heats the mass. The mass heats the room. The sleeper rests directly on the heated surface. The energy stored in that stone does not disappear up the chimney or leak through wall gaps. It radiates outward slowly and continuously, the same way a sun-warmed rock releases heat after sunset. The second critical principle involved flue path length. In a conventional iron stove, combustion gases travel from the firebox directly up a short pipe chimney. The contact time between hot gases and the stove's metal surface is measured in fractions of a second. The vast majority of heat produced by the fire exits through the chimney as hot exhaust rather than transferring to the room. In a masonry system with internal flue channels, the same gases are forced to travel 20 to 30 feet through stone passages before reaching the chimney exit. That extended contact time allows the stone to absorb heat that would otherwise be wasted. A well-designed masonry stove captures 80 to 90% of the fuel's thermal energy. A cast iron box stove captures 30 to 45% under ideal conditions and often far less in poor weather. Heinrich Thorne's letters describe the construction in practical terms. 3 feet of dense stone and clay between the firebox and the sleeping surface. Internal channels that forced hot combustion gases to travel a long path through the stone before exiting the chimney, extracting maximum heat before it escaped. A sleeping platform, flat and smooth, positioned directly over these channels with 3 to 4 inches of clay separating the sleeper from the heat below. The platform surface would never reach burning temperatures because the 4-inch clay layer moderated the heat transfer. What a sleeper felt was not the scorching surface of a fire, but the deep, penetrating warmth of a stone body that had been storing energy for 2 hours. The theory was sound. The question was whether frontier materials, fieldstone, local clay, chopped straw, and wood ash could replace the fired brick and lime mortar of European construction and still hold together through a Missouri winter. Elias would not know until he built it and tested it, and by the time he could test it, winter would already be coming back. Elias began preparation in late February while snow still covered the ground, identifying and stockpiling materials before the ground thawed enough to allow construction. The first task was stone selection, which proved more demanding than he had anticipated. Not all stone performs equally in thermal applications. Rocks with visible fractures crack under repeated heating and cooling cycles, eventually breaking apart and compromising the structure. Soft, crumbly stone absorbs moisture and spalls when exposed to high temperatures. Elias needed dense, hard, fracture-free stone in sufficient quantity to build a structure weighing close to a ton, and he needed flat-faced pieces that could be stacked and mortared without excessive trimming. He found what he needed at a talus slope 800 yards northeast of his cabin, where a limestone outcrop had shed material over centuries. The flat, dense pieces he selected ranged from the size of a thick book to slabs weighing 60 or 70 pounds. He tested each piece by striking it sharply with an iron bar. Solid stone rings clearly. Cracked or hollow stone produces a dull thud. He rejected roughly half of what he examined and hauled the acceptable pieces by sled over the course of 3 weeks, working in the late afternoons after the daily firewood and choring were done. The clay deposit he needed sat 600 yards east of his cabin along a creek bank, where a cut in the bank exposed a 4-foot seam of blue-gray material, unlike the sandy topsoil above it. This clay had been deposited in an ancient lake bed and compressed over thousands of years into a material that became plastic and smooth when mixed with water, but dried to near stone hardness over several days. Elias tested samples by rolling them into ropes half an inch thick and bending them into a U shape. Good structural clay bends without cracking. Poor clay fractures at the bend. The creek deposit passed the test cleanly. He hauled 40 wheelbarrow loads over the course of a week once the ground softened, storing the raw material under canvas tarps to prevent it from drying before use. His mortar formula came directly from Heinrich's letters, adapted to available materials. 4 parts blue clay, 2 parts coarse sand to reduce cracking during drying, 1 part chopped dry grass cut to 1-inch lengths for tensile binding, 1 part wood ash from the previous season's fires for potassium content that improved durability. Elias mixed each batch in a wooden trough built specifically for the purpose, adding water slowly and working the mixture with a wooden paddle until it achieved the consistency of thick bread dough, too wet and it slumped between stones without supporting weight, too dry and it crumbled without bonding. The correct consistency held its shape when pressed into a ball, but yielded smoothly under pressure. He spent 2 evenings mixing test batches, pressing them between stones and leaving them to dry in the cabin's warmth. By the 3rd day, he could evaluate the results. The mixture held without cracking under the conditions he expected during construction. Elias began construction in early March 1879 when the ground thawed enough to dig. He pulled up a section of plank flooring measuring 9 feet long by 5 feet wide in the corner of the cabin, opposite the iron stove, working the planks free with a pry bar and setting them aside for possible reuse. The excavation went 22 inches into the earth below, a difficult task in soil still half frozen at depth. He broke through the frost with an iron bar and scooped the loosened material with a short-handled spade, hauling it out in buckets and piling it behind the cabin. The pit he created was lined with a single course of flat fieldstone set dry without mortar. This drainage layer served 2 purposes. It prevented ground moisture from wicking upward into the clay mortar joints above, which would have caused deterioration over time. It also provided a level, stable base that distributed the eventual 1,800-pound load of the finished structure across a wide footprint, rather than concentrating it on soft, potentially settling soil. The firebox construction took 4 full days. Elias worked methodically, laying 1 course of stones each morning and allowing the mortar to set overnight before adding weight above. The firebox occupied one end of the foundation, its internal chamber measuring 24 inches wide, 20 inches deep, and 22 inches high, large enough to accept full-length split logs laid 2 side by side. He selected the largest, flattest stones for firebox walls, choosing pieces with parallel faces that could be stacked without gaps that would require excessive mortar to fill. The firebox walls rose 8 inches above floor level with a front opening 16 inches wide by 12 inches high. This opening was deliberately smaller than the internal chamber, a proportional calculation Heinrich had specified in his letters. A restricted opening controls air intake, which controls combustion rate. Too large an opening allows excessive air that burns the fire too hot and too fast, wasting fuel. The correct proportion creates a controlled burn that heats the stone efficiently over a 2-hour period, rather than a roaring blaze that exhausts fuel in 40 minutes. The interior firebox surfaces received special treatment. Elias applied a layer of pure clay 1 inch thick to all interior walls, smoothed with his hands wetted with water until the surface was almost glassy. This layer served as thermal protection for the structural stone beneath, preventing the direct heat of combustion from causing thermal shock to the masonry. He allowed this clay lining to cure for 3 days before proceeding. The flue system required the most precise and demanding work of the entire project. Starting from the back wall of the firebox, Elias constructed a horizontal channel running the full 9-foot length of the foundation at ground level. This passage measured 7 inches wide and 6 inches high, formed by laying flat stones as the floor and ceiling of the channel with vertical stones as side walls. The construction required constant attention to maintaining precise interior dimensions. Channels that narrowed at joints would restrict gas flow and reduce draft. Channels that widened created turbulence that reduced heat transfer efficiency. At the far end of the 9-foot horizontal run, the channel turned vertically upward through an 18-inch rise, then reversed direction into a second horizontal channel, running back toward the firebox end at a higher level. This second horizontal run traveled 7 feet before turning upward again, through a final vertical section that connected to the chimney exit port near the top of the structure. The complete path from firebox back wall to chimney connection measured 24 feet through the stone mass, more than 4 times the direct distance. Each time Elias completed a section of flue channel, he tested the passage by placing a small fire in the firebox and checking the smoke moved correctly through the system without backing up or escaping into the cabin. He found one section where a capstone had settled slightly and created a partial blockage, and he demolished and rebuilt that portion before proceeding. This kind of careful testing during construction prevented failures that would have been nearly impossible to correct after the structure was complete. The sleeping platform rose as the final element. Elias constructed it as a continuous flat surface 6 feet long by 4 feet wide, using the largest capstones he could handle, some requiring a wooden lever and fulcrum to position. These slabs sat directly over the upper flue channel with a 4-inch intermediate layer of smaller stones packed in clay mortar, separating the sleeping surface from the gas passages below. This intermediate layer performed the critical thermal moderation function, absorbing and redistributing heat so that the platform surface temperature stayed between 70 and 100 degrees rather than the 200 to 300 degrees that existed inside the flue channels below. The finished sleeping surface sat 16 inches above the cabin floor, roughly the same height as his previous pine bed platform. Elias spent 2 evenings grinding the surface stone smooth with a flat river stone, removing high points and filling low spots with clay until he had a flat, even surface that a mattress would lie on without rocking. He would place a simple, straw-filled tick mattress directly on the stone, and the combined thermal mass of stone and the body resting on it would create a sleeping environment unlike anything a conventional bed could provide. The entire structure weighed approximately 1,800 pounds when completed. Elias had consumed 3 weeks of work, 40 wheelbarrow loads of clay, and field stones he estimated at well over a ton. The iron stove remained in its corner as backup. He already suspected he would not need it. The first firing happened on a mild evening in late March, when outside temperatures sat around 18 degrees Fahrenheit. Elias built a small fire using dry hickory kindling arranged in a grid pattern at the front of the firebox, watching carefully for any sign of smoke entering the cabin rather than drawing up through the flue system. There was none. The flue system drew cleanly from the first moment of combustion, and he could feel the pull by holding his palm near the firebox opening. He fed the fire over 2 hours, adding split oak logs every 20 minutes in loads sized to the firebox capacity and maintaining a steady, moderate burn. He avoided both smoldering and roaring. Smoldering produces smoke and deposits. Roaring burns fuel faster, than the stone mass can absorb it. The correct burn rate was visible in the flame color, which should stay bright orange and yellow throughout, and in the chimney behavior, which should show little visible smoke once the fire was established and burning cleanly. When the wood burned down to coals, Elias sealed the firebox opening with a flat stone slab fitted into the opening and sealed around its edges with a clay paste. This seal prevented cold outdoor air from flowing backward through the flue system and cooling the stone mass during the night, a critical detail that Heinrich had emphasized in his letters. The clay seal was not permanent. It could be broken and reapplied each day, hardening slightly with each firing cycle, and requiring light trimming before reuse. By midnight, the sleeping platform surface registered approximately 95 degrees Fahrenheit when tested with his palm held flat and still for 10 seconds. The heat was not sharp or burning, but steady and deep, radiating upward through the mattress in a way that felt entirely different from the blast furnace heat of the iron stove. It was even. It came from below. It did not cycle on and off with the fire. Margaret placed her hand on the stone surface at the edge of the mattress and held it there for a long time without speaking. At 5 in the morning, Elias checked again. The platform measured approximately 72 degrees Fahrenheit, still noticeably warm 9 hours after the last log was added. He had slept through the night without waking once to feed a stove. The iron stove in the corner, unused, had been cold since midnight. The cabin's air temperature stood at 54 degrees Fahrenheit, warmer than any February or March morning they had experienced in that structure. Fuel consumption for the entire evening totaled 1/10 of a cord of split oak. His standard iron stove routine, which required feeding the fire every 2 to 3 hours throughout the night to maintain survivable temperatures, burned 2 to 3 times that amount for similar heating duration. Margaret said in the morning that she had not coughed since midnight. She had slept on warm stone through the coldest hours and woken without stiffness or chill for the first time in 4 months. She said it plainly and went to start breakfast. Elias stood for a moment longer beside the sleeping platform with his hand still on the stone. Roy Callaway noticed the reduced smoke from Elias's chimney in early April and rode over to investigate, assuming the Thorne family was burning less wood because they had run short. The reduced smoke was not what he expected to find there. What he found instead was a cabin that was noticeably warmer than his own on a cold April morning, with a smaller fire having burned the evening before and no fire burning currently. He stood in the doorway for a long moment without speaking, looking at the stone platform where Margaret sat, mending a shirt with her jacket off and her sleeves rolled up. "That thing actually works," Callaway said finally. Not as a question. He walked to the platform and pressed his hand against it, held it there, then looked at Elias without saying anything else for a full minute. James Whitfield visited the following week with his wife. He ran his hand across the sleeping platform surface, noted the temperature, then walked the perimeter of the structure, examining the mortar joints, checking for cracks, testing the corners for solidity. He asked how long it had taken to build, listened to the answer, and stood looking at the structure for a long time. "How long does the heat last?" he asked. 12 hours minimum from a 2-hour fire, Elias said. "More if the outside temperature is not extreme." Whitfield said nothing more that day, but returned 2 weeks later with a leather journal and questions about flue channel dimensions. The most telling response came from old Augustus Meade. He arrived alone on a Tuesday morning in late April, tying his horse without speaking to anyone, walking directly to the sleeping platform and pressing both palms flat against the stone surface. He stood like that for nearly 10 minutes. His hands were badly arthritic from decades of frontier work, swollen at the knuckles and stiff in the cold, and the deep, penetrating warmth of the stone was visibly affecting him in a way that the shallow, radiant heat of a cast iron stove could not replicate. My grandmother had something like this in Bavaria, he said quietly, still looking at his hands on the stone. I always thought it was just an old story. He left without saying much more, but he came back the following month and spent an afternoon asking detailed questions about the clay formula. The winter of 1879 to 1880 delivered the conditions that separated functional systems from theoretical ones. An ice storm in mid-December coated every surface in the Ozark Highlands with 2 inches of glaze ice, followed by an Arctic air mass that drove temperatures to between 10 and 22 below zero Fahrenheit and held them there for 19 consecutive days. Wind from the northwest came through the valley gaps at 30 miles per hour, pushing effective temperatures below -40 by any practical measure. Snow accumulated to 3 feet on level ground, with drifts reaching 6 feet against north-facing walls. The creek froze solid in 48 hours. Roy Callaway's situation deteriorated first. His cabin, built to standard specifications with a single Quincy stove, essentially identical to the one Elias had stopped using, consumed firewood at a rate that alarmed him by the 3rd day of the freeze. By day 7, he had burned through his entire reserve supply and began taking boards from the barn siding, calculating that the livestock could tolerate reduced wind protection better than the family could tolerate cold inside. His family slept in rotations through the coldest nights, 2 people awake at all times to feed the stove, while the others slept fully clothed under every available blanket and buffalo robe. Interior temperatures in the far corners of the cabin dropped to 28 degrees Fahrenheit on the coldest nights, above freezing only barely and only near the stove. James Whitfield's water supply froze on day 4, despite the barrel sitting 2 feet from his stove door. Melting enough ice for basic daily water requirements, burned a quarter cord of additional wood daily, accelerating his fuel crisis. His 2 milk cows reduced production dramatically from lack of liquid water and the stress of a barn that could not be heated adequately. One of them developed a respiratory illness by week 2 that would cost him the animal in the spring. Augustus Meade's old cabin, built in 1848 with thinner walls than more recent construction and chinking that had deteriorated over 3 decades, became essentially uninhabitable by day 6. The aging structure simply could not retain enough heat at those temperatures, regardless of how much wood he burned. Meade moved his wife and daughter to the Callaway trading post on day 9, admitting openly that his structure had failed. He spent the remaining 10 days of the freeze sitting in a corner of the trading post, watching Callaway's family struggle with a heating system that was slightly better than his own, but still fundamentally inadequate. Elias Thorne's evening routine continued unchanged throughout all 19 days. Each evening, at dusk, he built a single fire in the clay bed firebox using dry split hickory hauled in from the woodshed, fed it for 90 minutes, sealed the opening, and went to bed. The clay-plastered walls he had added to the cabin in November, following the same thermal mass principles as the sleeping platform, absorbed radiant heat during the evening firing and released it gradually through the night, moderating the air temperature throughout the cabin rather than just near the fire. The sleeping platform temperature at bedtime ran between 88 and 94 degrees Fahrenheit. By morning, it registered between 65 and 70 degrees, warm enough for completely comfortable rest with a single blanket. Interior air temperature in the Thorne cabin held between 48 and 62 degrees Fahrenheit throughout all 19 days of the freeze. Cold by summer standards, warm enough to allow the family to move freely without coats indoors, to keep all stored water liquid, to maintain food preservation conditions throughout the cellar, and to sleep through the night without waking. Fuel consumption averaged 1/8 of a cord per day. Elias had entered the freeze with a woodshed containing 4 full cords of well-seasoned hickory and oak, dried for 18 months under cover. After 19 days, he had consumed slightly less than 2.5 cords, leaving 1.5 cords in reserve and the freeze still technically ongoing. Roy Callaway had burned through 6 cords plus barn siding and fence boards, and estimated he would have exhausted all available combustible material within another week had temperatures remained. On day 14, Margaret Thorne cooked a full meal at the cabin's cooking hearth and served it at the table. Thomas played on the floor. She had not bothered to put on her coat. She did not mention this. She did not need to. The first neighbor to appear at the Thorne cabin during the freeze was Whitfield's 14-year-old son, sent by his father on day 12 to ask if Elias had wood to sell at any price. Elias sent the boy back with a quarter cord and refused payment. Callaway appeared himself on day 15 with a handwritten note asking for the exact measurements of the firebox opening and the flue channel cross-sections. He had spent his days in the trading post sketching plans on brown paper and was committed to rebuilding before the following winter regardless of cost. Meade came to the Thorne cabin on day 17, riding from the trading post in the last of the afternoon light. He sat down without being asked, accepted a cup of coffee from Margaret, and pressed his arthritic hands against the sleeping platform surface for a long time. "I'm 67 years old," he said finally. "I've built 5 cabins in this valley, all of them the same wrong way." He finished the coffee, thanked Margaret, and rode back to the trading post in the dark. The 19-day freeze broke in early February 1880 when a warm front pushed north from Arkansas, and temperatures climbed above freezing for the first time in 3 weeks. The creek thawed in 4 days. The drifts shrank for 2 weeks. And for the first time since the previous spring, the settlers of that Ozark Valley had time to assess what had happened to them. The accounting was practical and direct. Callaway had lost most of his barn siding and a section of fence, material he would spend 2 weeks of spring labor replacing. Whitfield had lost a cow worth $14 and would carry that loss through planting season. Meade's old cabin required either major reconstruction or abandonment, a decision he and his wife had already made during the freeze. Several families in the wider valley had suffered frozen food stores, damaged livestock, and one case of cold injury to a child that would affect the boy's hands for the rest of his life. Elias Thorne had lost nothing. His livestock were healthy. His food stores were intact. His family was well. By spring of 1880, 4 new structures in the valley were under construction, with clay thermal mass beds incorporated into the design. James Whitfield hired Elias for 2 weeks in April to supervise the masonry work on his rebuilt cabin, paying him in labor exchange for the summer's fencing work. Roy Callaway, who had mocked the idea loudest at the trading post gathering 1 year earlier, had already purchased clay tools and was quarrying stone from the same talus slope before the snow was fully gone. He did not ask Elias about it directly, but worked from the measurements Whitfield showed him. Augustus Meade rebuilt his cabin entirely from scratch, choosing a new site on better drained ground and incorporating a masonry heating platform as the first and most important structural element, building everything else around it. Heinrich Thorne's letters, which Elias had kept in a leather pouch for years as family history, were copied by hand by James Whitfield and circulated to 2 families in the next valley who had heard about the system through trading post conversation. The copies were rough and incomplete, but contained the critical mortar formula and flue channel dimensions that made the difference between a structure that worked and one that didn't. What Elias Thorne had proven was not a new idea. His grandfather's generation had understood thermal mass heating for centuries. What the frontier mentality had prioritized instead was speed, cheapness, and the assumption of impermanence. Build fast. Build light. Move on. Invest nothing you cannot afford to leave behind. These were rational survival priorities for people moving into unknown territory with limited resources and no guarantee of staying. The problem was that these priorities became habits long after the circumstances that justified them had passed. Settlers who intended to stay, who had proved their claims and planted their fields and built their barns, were still building heating systems designed for temporary occupation. They were building as if they might leave next spring when most of them would die on that land. That assumption killed people in sustained cold, not quickly or dramatically, slowly, through exhaustion from constant fire feeding, through illness from perpetually damp, cold air, through the cascade of problems created when a family's resources are consumed, keeping one room barely above freezing instead of maintaining a structure that actually functions. The clay bed system cost 3 weeks of labor and approximately the same material expense as a standard iron stove. It required no purchased components beyond what the land immediately provided. No trained mason, no fired brick, no lime mortar. The only expertise required was careful reading and methodical work, both of which Elias Thorne possessed in ordinary measure. It delivered warmth that lasted through the night from a single 2-hour evening fire, reduced fuel consumption by 60 to 70% compared to conventional iron stove heating, and provided a sleeping surface that maintained comfortable temperatures throughout the coldest night on record in that valley. The principle behind it does not age. Dense material absorbs heat during a fire. Dense material releases heat slowly after the fire is gone. The geometry of internal flue channels determines how much heat is captured before exhaust escapes. A sleeping surface positioned over those channels receives continuous warmth for as long as the stored energy lasts. That is not folklore. That is not old country tradition being preserved for sentimental reasons. That is physics operating identically in the Ozark Highlands of 1879 and in any structure you build today on any piece of land in any cold climate on Earth. The difference between Elias Thorne's family and his neighbors during those 19 days was not wealth, luck, or superior materials. It was the decision to build something heavy, permanent, and based on a principle that does not negotiate with the temperature outside. The men who laughed at his clay bed in February of 1879 were burning their furniture by January of 1880. Some ideas look foolish until the weather arrives to explain them.